Welcome to Integrated Insights with ICCG. For more than 30 years, our team has partnered with small business owners to prepare for and navigate the business transaction process. Pull up a chair as we share stories and insights from our experience on all sides of the M&A table. And welcome back to another episode of Integrated Insights. My name is Michael Hefner. I'll be your host today. I'm joined by the founders of ICCG, Grant McQuilkin and Dave Parker. Thanks, guys, for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having us again.
Yeah, today we're going to be talking about cutoffs. So a lot of business owners that may not have experience doing business transactions in the past, they may just think that, as soon as closing happens, that they're done, right? Nothing else occurs. But the fact of the matter is, hey, there are close-offs that occur or cutoffs that occur at the time of closing, but some are more of a transition, right, over time. So we're going to talk about that difference today. So to get started, let's talk about cutoffs that happen at closing. Some of those, like accounts payable, what do those look like? And why do they happen at closing versus as a transition period?
Yeah, so I'm going to turn this over to Grant, let him kind of lead the dance on this one. But I want to say out of the chute that if you're listening, that this is super important, especially if you're thinking about selling your business, because it has everything to do with how you can be as smooth as you want to up to closing, and everything can go really in a south, it can go south quickly after closing if the transitions aren't correct, because you've built up trust, and all of a sudden something wonky happens and you think, oh, are they, one side is accusing the other of not being distrustful. And that's when things can really fall apart. So I think it's really important that what Grant's going to talk about is taken to heart and is also scripted really, really clearly so that everyone understands their responsibilities. And then there is no issue.
It's also up to us and the client to really understand their own business, right? So some people recognize revenue when they receive the money, for example, and some people recognize revenue when they bill their customer. And so understanding that and understanding the revenue cycle, understanding the whole process of accounts payable, the process of inventory, kind of gives us a heads up on how we need to handle that cutoff, right? And the most common way that we do that is we put in a formula called working capital, and we can always go back to that video, but we script what those cutoffs are going to look like. And the hope is that while there might be some reconciliation at closing, that the buyer has the best view of what that cutoff was because he has hindsight. He can go back and actually see exactly what it ended up being. And then there's a settlement of who owes what 60 or 90 days later. I think actually scripting those cutoffs is super important in understanding exactly the timing of it, but also how the business works. We've just closed a deal in the medical world, in the medical service world, where we close at 7 p.m. because that's when the shift ended. And so it makes the payroll cutoffs really much easier. And it's very easy to see the time that a patient was seen based on the medical history and therefore the claims that happened prior to that or the revenue that happened prior to that. It's easy to get the cutoffs. Whereas if we made it at midnight, we'd have to, which is where most closings happen, effective midnight is in that particular world would have been a little bit more awkward and subjective with regards to labor and whatever else they use when they see those patients.
Or you may choose the end of a payroll period, right?
Yeah.
Which could be the midnight or the 7, depending on what the business is, but end of a payroll, then sometimes you're giving out a short paycheck, which then throws the employees off. And I'd say whatever these cutoffs, whatever you can do to keep the consistency in that business, especially with your employees, and make sure that they're not affected. They're not affected negatively by what's going on. Much, much better off.
Yeah, if you got 250 employees that you have to onboard and then pay payroll in 3 days' time, that's just really difficult. And so working through those, who's going to pay what is super important ahead of time so that there are no surprises and a rat race at the end.
Yeah. And I'd also say that make sure that the intermediary you're working with, if you're working with, and hopefully you are working with one, is someone who's capable of helping you through all this. Because, I think in some cases, a broker may come along and just when the deal's done, they're on to the next one. But, we really try to work with our clients and make sure that the script is followed out. And sometimes that takes a long time. It takes weeks. I mean, I know Grant has gone in and helped with reconciliations on working capital cutoffs. And then that true up, 9 or 6 months later, 3 months later, whatever it is.
Yeah. I think just understanding that there's an issue is super helpful for our clients as well, because we can go through the balance sheet and the income statement and see what is going to be an issue. And so, going, dang it, I forgot to take inventory of supplies, or I forgot to take inventory of work in process, or those kinds of things. Well, you can't reinvent that. It's just almost impossible. And so it just is another reason why there might be conflict between a buyer and a seller after the fact. And like Dave said, you want to reduce that possibility as much as possible by creating certainties and so anticipating what you need to do is super helpful. Some things are very easy to do ahead of time. So, for example, advertising expense, you typically prepay that. And so you booked the trade show in 6 months' time, you paid the fees already, so it's a prepaid expense. Things like rent. You know that if you close on the 15th of the month, then there's going to be 15 days of prepaid rent or 16 days of prepaid rent, depending on the month. So those you can allocate ahead of time. You know exactly what that is. Inventory is difficult. If we have a very, if inventory is a very, big part of the balance sheet, then you've got to set up the process to where the count is done, at the same time that the revenue cutoff is done, right? And the biggest hassle that we ever have is work in process. And so if you've got a manufacturing company with 60 machines humming all the time, then understanding how much labor and materials has gone into those jobs that have not been billed yet, or maybe they've got advance payments, those are difficult, and they're processes that the client is not used to doing typically. At least not with the accuracy that a buyer and seller want at closing. And so we have to go in there and talk to them and find out how they normally do it, and then change their processes a little bit so that it'll be satisfactory to the buyer.
Yeah, another one would be construction, right? Because construction, you may have had, you've got your different payments that are happening along the way to the contractor, and they may have been preloaded on some of those payments, right? So they may have been already paid for work that was done in advance that isn't completed yet. So then there's a whole other calculation, right?
Yeah. The percentage completion calculation happened in a plumbing company that we did that was very focused on construction, on multifamily construction. And so they had massive contracts that were, a certain percentage complete, and that calculation has some estimates in there, and it can really, really change the working capital formula if you get those incorrect. And so part of our job is to create trust in the buyer's mind by giving an adequate amount of time for them to justify that percentage completion calculation in hindsight.
Without going too deep into it, Grant, on that work in process, you just talked about a lot of the complications that can happen at closing with the cutoffs and stuff. But we also see a lot of companies that, quote unquote, should have working capital that don't. Why is it worth it to deal with that hassle, or is it better to just not have working process, even if that's typical for your industry?
Yeah, I mean, we see. And in fact, Michael, you and I looked at a couple of balance sheets that we know there's work in process, but they just don't track it. And so it really depends on our communication with our clients and how important that is. When we sat down with a guy a couple of days ago and asked him about work in process, and he goes, I don't know what it is or whatever. And then we kind of asked some questions, and it's a few $100,000. Well, it doesn't really change the P&L from a buyer's perspective, because there's a beginning balance at the beginning of the year and an ending balance at the end of the year. And so if you're doing the same amount of business, then it's a wash on the P&L. But when you're buying a business and all of a sudden you've got, $500,000 worth of work in process inventory, it's never been on the balance sheet. How do you deal with that with a buyer? The buyer doesn't want to pay for it because it was never on your balance sheet to begin with. And the seller's going, man, I earned some money. I spent a lot of money on those jobs. You're just going to finish them up and then bill it. And so those are the kinds of conversations that we talk through with our clients and make sure that there's a solution.
And I would say, as a seller, if you're going to come to the table, if you're looking to sell your business, think of all those things that, all these questions are rattling in your back of your mind, not my mind, your mind, that, like, I've got, $100,000 worth of pipe in the backyard. What do I do about that? All those different things. Think of them ahead of time, because we've had a lot of clients that think of them the day of closing, and that's too late to think about it. It's like, oh, by the way, well, it's a little late, Yeah,
and then you get this crazy conversation where the seller says, "Well, if you're not going to pay me for it, I'll just take it."
Yeah, it's like take that pipe.
The reason why it's not on your balance sheet is because you're written it off. And so, you're selling 100% of the assets that are in the business. And so that's included unless you've thought about it ahead of time and warned the buyer, right?
That's great. Yeah, I just think about the best time often to sell, right? To bring your company to market can be when you're growing. So if work in process is what helps you to capture that growth the best with bigger jobs coming on board, then it's worth keeping track of for sure to get that value.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so that's awesome.
And so when we market the business, even though it's not on the financial statements, we need to let the buyers know, hey, by the way, there's anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000 of work in process at any given moment. Is just not tracked on their financial statements, unfortunately.
So to this point, we've mostly just talked about cutoffs at closing. So let's transition a little bit to the items that take a little bit of time to transition, or things that might come up, right? And Dave, you mentioned at the beginning, things might go wrong. And how do you deal with some of those things? What are some of those items? What does that look like?
Yeah, I'll remind Dave of one that is difficult. Dave has quarterbacked some transactions in the medical industry, and the service providers uniquely have a bank account associated with the payer, with the insurance company. So, for example, Blue Cross will have a claim that then is paid to the claimant's, to the service provider's bank account. And to change that bank account is extremely difficult, and you may not get paid at that point. And so the buyer has to have control over the seller's bank account at closing, which is really unique to that industry. Normally, you just tell the customer, hey, send it to me and not to to Joe Seller, because I've just bought the company, and the seller communicates with that client and everything's fine. But in this huge company environment that is the medical insurance business, it is extremely difficult to change. And so it warrants a little bit of a special workaround. And this is where I think Dave is so good about, okay, here's the problem. Let's find a solution. And so it produces all kinds of crazy reconciliations with regards to cutoffs, but it's doable. But it creates an environment where you have to work with each other in order to get it done the way that the document's script.
Yeah, you have to trust each other on that one. And that's, that particular situation only applies if they're buying part or all of the accounts receivables, because all the past claims have to go into that bank account. There is no other, they're tied to some specific billing numbers, and they have to go into that bank account. So there has to be some give and take on this. In some cases, it's been really, really simple and everyone understands it. And other times we'll just say hasn't been so easy.
Well, I think, I think it's also applicable to other industries as well, where you have vendor contracts, where you have customer contracts that you need to pursue to make sure that those banking details are changed, for example. But there's going to be issues, and just knowing ahead of time what they might be and arranging for that. Hey, you're going to get a payment from such and such a customer. When you get it, would you forward it to us? Basically, we've tried to change the uniform company's draft out of our bank account. This is a classic example because dealing with uniform companies is almost impossible. But they keep on drafting the payment out of the seller's bank account. And so the seller needs to keep the bank account open to clear up any last minute distributions and all those kinds of things. And then he gets dinged for $1,000 uniform bill. So you can get mad about it, or you can already have the heads up from the intermediary saying, hey, you probably are going to get some bills, but that's okay because there's a holdback to cover it, but there's also a process where you can just submit those to the buyer, and the buyer will cover those bills.
Talk a little bit more about that vendor stuff. So you gave a really good example there, Grant. But what about like continuation or changing of vendors? What does that look like after closing?
Well, that just takes a lot of cooperation. Once again, you may have a strategic buyer who's coming in who has other locations or other similar type businesses. They're bringing in some of their own vendors. All that needs to be fleshed out in due diligence. And there's schedules in the purchase agreement that will kind of outline who the current vendors are, who the contracts are with. And it's really important as a seller to make sure you've listed everything, because there's going to be some of those vendors who you need to cancel, and a buyer they're not going to be responsible for canceling someone they're not going to use. And that has also been a source of contention. Or a buyer comes in, as Grant's mentioned, is wanting to change a vendor or is wanting to use a vendor, but they find that there's a past due amount. You try to find out as much of that as you can during the due diligence process, and then make sure that it's listed on these schedules so that everyone's aware. Even with that, things slip through the cracks and they just have to be dealt with. But, vendors like to know that they're going to be paid for their past bills, which is why a working capital true up works really nice, because working capital calculation like we use allows then for us to go off and pay those past bills, and it becomes a credit to the buyer for that working capital calculation. So, but that just takes time. I mean, you think about these cycles you may have a vendor that's once a quarter. It might be a maintenance person who's coming in to check the HVAC. All those things kind of come up as time goes on. And we just tell the seller, if they haven't been this is one of the reasons I think Grant has a great idea. He always tells the seller that, if you're not needed or they're not going to contract to have you around any longer, or maybe after the 3 or 6 month period that you're contracted to be there, have them pay for your cell phone so they know they can get a hold of you. And, because they're going to call in and say, we've been trying to get a hold of this vendor. Do you have any contacts over there or whatever? So just those helpful pieces. And by all means, if you're the seller and you're going to offer that, answer your phone.
We had a nightmare situation happen with one of our clients. We helped them sell their companies, and 2 years later, they got sued. And the reason is because the buyer built up all this over $100,000 worth of bills on this particular vendor, but the buyer did not change the account. And so they were responsible for it because it was their contract. And so you have to be really careful with, as a seller, to make sure that if you have guaranteed any of that stuff, or if you are on the hook, then you remain on the hook as long as they're using your account. And so just be careful with that. And I would get some advice from the intermediaries for sure, but there's some business street smart sense over there that you need to go, okay, these guys can build up, and then I'm still on the hook. Your lawyer will say, well, there's indemnities and all kinds of stuff, but there's not a whole lot of ways. In that particular case, the buyer 2 years later went bankrupt. And so the indemnification is worthless because they can't go after the buyer at that point. And so the seller is stuck with negotiating this $100,000 supply bill, which is awful.
Great example of why to prepare for it and expectations that you can have for it. Hey, before we wrap up, do y'all have anything else you would share to business owners just regarding expectations and preparing for cutoffs?
Yeah, I think the last thought I would say is obviously, having experienced intermediaries that kind of walk you through ahead of time. As a business owner, you're smart enough to know where your exposure is. But one of the most important conversations that needs to take place, and business owners don't really want to talk to the insurance agent about selling because sometimes they are the same insurance agents for their competitors. And so knowing whether your insurance is event-based or claim-based, whether you're going to have to purchase a tail policy, you never want to be without insurance. And so, insurance is one of those things that can go away the day you stop owning the business. And then if a claim happens a month later on a job that you did before you sold, you don't have any insurance. And so just be careful with that, and just it's important to engage your insurance professional at the right time to determine whether you have any exposure there.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think we've said on here a lot in the past. Business owners that we work with are really good at what they do. We know a lot about what's customary and what your options are regarding business transactions. So we'd love to sit down with business owners just to help walk through a business transaction as a whole, as well as the cutoffs associated. But hey, guys, thanks for joining me today. That's all the time we have, but we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode of Integrated Insights with ICCG. Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more stories from our team. We love hearing from our listeners. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, please send us an email in the show notes. For more information about ICCG, please check us out on our website or follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Until next time, there's always a seat at our table.